Good morning. Ribhu Gita, Song of Ribhu, chapter 33. The greatness of the undivided knowledge of the self. Verse 1. There's nothing ever here as all this. Further, Nidaga, I shall tell you clearly about the undivided knowledge of the self, that all is of the nature of the indivisible Supreme Brahman, which is not different from the self. And we are that all-pervading Supreme Brahman. Those who listen happily to this auspicious explanation shall never be submerged in the ocean of worldly misery. Two. Son, the self, which is our nature, indeed is the indicated meaning of the word I. The indicated meaning of the word Brahman is the nature of the Supreme Brahman. The identity of the Self and the Supreme is the undivided truth proclaimed in the meaning of all the Mahavakyas, like I am Brahman and others. 3. Therefore, thus attaining steadfastly the doubtless differenceless certitude that I am Brahman and that Brahman is myself, is the differenceless knowledge of the undivided self. There is no knowledge anywhere to equal this faultless, undivided knowledge of the self. Great sage, those who have attained the knowledge of this undivided self will never have further suffering. I say this in the name of Shiva. 4. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will dispel the delusion that I am the body and such. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will make one the undivided, complete, perfectly full Brahman. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will destroy the illusion of endless varieties. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will confer undivided supreme bliss. 5. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will be the renunciation of wandering thought. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will be of the nature of the destruction of the meandering mind. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will be the release from the originless bondage of worldly existence. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will confer undivided, supreme liberation. 6. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, is by far the best yoga. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, is the nature of the blemishless and self-luminous. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will be the removal of the darkness of ignorance. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will be the destruction of various forms of fear. 7. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will be the destruction of many great sins. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, transcends endless aspects of Dharma. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, confers wondrous auspiciousness. The knowledge of the self, of the conviction that I am Brahman, will rid one of a variety of things that are inauspicious. 8. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization I am Brahman, arises out of deep discrimination. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization I am Brahman, is obtained by the grace of the Guru. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, is strengthened by constant practice. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization I am Brahman, is obtained by the grace of the self. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, stays firm by the grace of the undivided Supreme Shiva. 9. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will be strengthened by repeated practice. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will heighten happiness by repeated practice. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will end all sorrow by repeated practice. And the knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will become natural by repeated practice. 10. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will remove wrong understanding by repeated practice. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will clear all taint by repeated practice. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will become unshakable by repeated practice. By repeated practice, the knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, leads to samadhi, to intense, deep absorption. 11. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will stand fast only for the practitioner who practices daily. The knowledge of the self, which is the realization that I am Brahman, will stand fast only for the practitioner who practices always. The knowledge of this self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, will destroy all superimpositions. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, will give the success of an unwavering mind. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, is of the nature of the undivided awareness, with nothing apart. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, will destroy all superimpositions on that Brahman. 12. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, can easily be attained by those who are rid of the sense of I. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, will arise pleasantly for those who have a plenitude of virtue. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, will be more wondrous than all the wondrous things. The knowledge of the self, carrying the conviction that I am Brahman, is the experience of the undivided Shiva and of others. 13. Whatever is seen as an illusion on the self is nothing in the least apart from that self, but only the blemishless substratum, the self. There is nothing here to equal the knowledge of the undivided self, which realizes that I, the undivided, complete, perfectly full self, am indeed Brahman, indicated by that. The only equal of that knowledge of the self is that knowledge itself. 14. The only apt fruit of such knowledge of the intense certitude of the undivided self, that I am Brahman, and Brahman is myself, and I am all, is the nature of the undivided self. Nothing else is fit as its fruit. Who in the universe is competent to fully extol the greatness of this praiseworthy knowledge of the undivided self, except Maheshvara, the great Lord? Is there anyone else except that omniscient one? 15. There is nothing created in the world that can compare with the knowledge of the undivided self, confirmed by the sure faith that I am Brahman. There is nothing to compare with it in anything yet to be created. For those who have decided with certitude that I am Brahman, that certitude itself is millions of sacrifices, penances, holy waters, holy charities, and service, and all else. There's no confusion in this. 16. The certitude that I am Brahman is the worship of the gods. The certitude that I am Brahman is the contemplation of the gods. The certitude that I am Brahman is japa, the repetition of a mantra, and tapas, intense practice. The certitude that I am Brahman is all the virtues. The certitude that I am Brahman is the undivided meditation. The certitude that I am Brahman is the undivided yoga. The certitude that I am Brahman is the undivided knowledge. And the certitude that I am Brahman is the undivided liberation. 17. If, because of the wavering of the fickle mind, the experience of the undivided self does not directly result, one should meditate on the self being all, until all the distortions of the mind are overcome. If the ever-moving mind meanders, making a mockery of meditation, one can recite aloud the words of this text on the topic of the motionless, undivided self. 18. As there is no strain in uttering the sound of these words, all those who are not competent in such meditation as this should, until the mind settles in the conviction, the bhava, of one's own nature, and direct knowledge arises unmistakably, say aloud the sounds that affirm the changeless nature of the undivided self of all being Brahman, and that Brahman being myself, and I being nothing but that Brahman. 19. Even by proclaiming aloud that all is Brahman, without attaining lasting awareness, one can attain in a trice the merit of performing 1,000,000 horse sacrifices. One who clearly utters aloud that I am Brahman can reap the result of giving in charity the great Meru mountain. If one says lovingly, I am Brahman, the fruits of offering the entire earth may accrue to him. 20. Giving all the things in all the worlds is no equal at all to having the constant certitude in this manner that Brahman is myself and I am Brahman. No happiness could ever be equal to this constant conviction, this bhava, that Brahman is myself and I am Brahman. The only equal to that exclusive happiness is that happiness itself. 21. For those who are sure that all is Brahman, and I am that, and I am ever that, and are filled with that certitude, there is no exalted shrine, holy waters, charities, virtuous conduct, duty, devotion, and not an atom of action apart from themselves. Is there any glory greater than the sure meditation that Brahman is all, and I am that Brahman? 22. Therefore, casting aside intellectual differences, even in dream, that there is even an atom apart from Brahman, and strengthening yourself with the firm resolve that Brahman is all and I am that, and fortifying this certitude, and being of such changeless conviction, bhava, attain the experience of the originless, endless, undivided nature, and be filled with that. 23. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the Eternal. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the Pure. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the Knowledge. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the Liberated. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the Motionless. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the Unattached. I am ever the undivided Supreme Brahman. Being of such conviction, such bhava, become that yourself. 24. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, full of existence. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the permanent. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, full of consciousness. I am ever the Supreme Brahman of the nature of consciousness. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the blemishless. I am ever the Supreme Brahman, the formless. I am ever the undivided Supreme. Being always of such conviction, bhava, become that yourself. 25. I indeed am Brahman, which is whole and perfectly full. I indeed am Brahman, which has no sankalpa, concept, or fixed ideas, or vikalpa, doubt, differences, imagination, and indecision. I am indeed Brahman, which is without a speck of taint. I indeed am Brahman, the pure without duality. I indeed am Brahman, which is the peerless expanse of consciousness. I indeed am Brahman, which is all pervasive with no interstices. I am the undivided Supreme Brahman, which is not conditioned by I. Being always of such conviction, such bhava, become that yourself. 26. I indeed am Brahman, the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, the motionless and peaceful. I indeed am Brahman, the eternal and attributeless. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, the unsurpassed and blissful. I indeed am Brahman, the pure Supreme Truth. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, pure mind. I am the non-dual, undivided Supreme Brahman. Being always of such conviction, such a bhava, become that yourself. 27. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is equanimous. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is unattached. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which has no sense of possession. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, the Great. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, the Spotless. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which has no modifications. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, the blemishless. Being always of this conviction, bhava, become that yourself. 28. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is indestructible. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is all pervasive. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is ancient. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is real. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, without mind. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, without delusions. I am the Supreme Brahman, which is afflictionless. Being always of such conviction, bhava, become that yourself. Hmm. 28, I think. Not sure. I think that's where I am. 28. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is indestructible. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is all pervasive. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is ancient. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is real. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, without mind. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, without delusions. I am the Supreme Brahman, which is afflictionless. Being always of such conviction, bhava, become that yourself. 29. Apart from the Supreme Brahman, which is consciousness alone, there are no individuals, no Lord, and no world. The Supreme Brahman, which is nothing but existence, is the reality that ever stands by itself. Being of the definite certitude that this Supreme Brahman, which is goodness alone, is myself, and becoming yourself the Supreme Brahman, which is that alone, be happy without the least weariness. 30. By the conviction, the bhava, that all is Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss, which is not different from the self, that the Supreme Brahman without duality is myself, and I am indeed that Supreme Brahman, and thereby removing altogether all the misconceptions of the mind, and attaining the pure knowledge of the undivided self, remain as yourself and be happy always. 31. Those who have the knowledge of the undivided self without a second, that all the illusory conditionings in me, the all complete and whole, when deeply inquired into by a process of negation, are not a particle different from me, and that I, the residue, am of the Supreme Brahman, will abide as the nature of the Supreme Brahman, the mass of bliss. What is told is the truth. There's no doubt of this. 32. For the benefit of all, I have thus explained to you, Nidaga, the limitless greatness of the unparalleled knowledge of the undivided self, as expounded by the great Lord Ishvara. Those who continually listen with a pure mind to this explanation that destroys all bondage will attain the knowledge of the undivided self, and rendering asunder their bondages, be established in the nature of the undivided Supreme Brahman. 33. The liberated are those who, without being overcome by trivial enjoyment of the heavens and such, which is as illusory as the horn of a horse, and without wasting time on fruitless action, study the purport of the Vedas, and by means of listening and such, realize the nature of the undivided Shiva. Thus did sage Ribhu explain to Nidaga the pure knowledge of the self. 34. It is the infinite form of our immaculate, delusionless Lord in a state of joyous dance that proclaims, those who, by a process of negation, realize that all conditionings, inherently unnatural, exist not, and attain the knowledge of the self, that is the identity of the self and the Supreme with nothing apart, shall ever remain fearless, unfragmented, abiding as the nature of the Supreme Self. So that ends the chapter, the 33rd chapter of the Ribhu Gita. Have a good day.